Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Yes, I will. And in fact, I posted the PowerPoint slide for yesterday already. The notes will be in each of the folders for the week. So the PowerPoint slides will be. I'm going to post a video on how to take notes soon. But I'll just say up here up front, for taking notes on the lectures, my advice is to take notes as you watch. Don't get wrapped up in writing down the PowerPoints because, again, they'll be available, right? They'll be right there. They'll be right there available to you and given to you, any of the PowerPoints for the lectures. What I would say, and one person actually wrote me and asked about, having trouble seeing the PowerPoint slides in the YouTube videos because they're smaller. Well, I put those up there basically so you can know where I am during the lecture. But the thing to do would be to download the PowerPoints if you're watching it on video. For those of you guys in the room, you can see it pretty well, right? If you're watching it live, because wait a second. Let me actually give some evidence for my thesis there. There we go. So if you're here live, you can see the screen pretty good, yeah. But if you're watching it on the video, go to the folder. When I post the video of the lecture, I'll also post the PowerPoint. And that way it'll be available there for you guys who are watching at home or wherever you are. I mean, I don't imagine you guys are like going out to a field and watching this on a projector. But hey, if you are, that's cool. You guys, slow down. Yeah, so those will be there, and just keep up with them when you're taking notes. If you're watching this, or live, or if you're watching it on the video, my advice would be to take notes on the lecture as I'm talking. Keep focused on the major points. That way you'll kind of know if I didn't go over something well enough for you, right? Instead of writing down the points. I mean, you can write down the words that are on the slide, but that's not really going to explain much to you. But if you're listening to what I say, you make notes. Then as you go along in the class, however frequently you need to, take your notes, go to the PowerPoints, and use them to study. So go through the PowerPoints point by point. There's more information on these earlier ones because I'm trying to get through a lot. But on the later ones, there will be an average, shouldn't be an unreasonable number of points. If you understand everything on the PowerPoint slide from your notes, then you're fine. But if you're studying as we go along and you look at your notes and you see something on the PowerPoint slide that doesn't make any sense, then, if you're in the room with me right now, then just kind of put your hand up and be like, hey, Dr. Sawyer, I don't quite understand that. That might save everyone some trouble who's watching. But if you're actually watching the video and you have a question, just shoot me a message and I will try to respond to questions about the actual material from the class here in the lectures. So if you have a question, there's a chance other people have that same question. I can address that up front and we can kind of run through that. Cool? That makes sense? Anyone else have a question before we get going? All right, cool. Well then, let's get rolling. Welcome to History 2020. The class that answers the question, what would it look like if my professor started cutting his own hair with kid scissors? I'm Dr. Sawyer. I am that professor. And let me tell you, we're going to see what happens. The best part about this is I can only see the front. I can only see me straight on, right? That's what you guys mostly see in the video. But if we keep going at this rate, at some point in April, I'm going to turn around. You're going to see my Billy Ray whip around the back. That old mullet's going to be growing out in the back. I'm going to have to find somebody who can take care of that for me. Anyway, so that's where we're at today in class. We're going to keep rolling with the theme of the Constitution, and we're going to carry this through. We're going to essentially recap the end of what you probably studied in 2010. If you're in my class, it will be where we left off. As I said, to just pick right back up. And we'll keep going with it. So I want to kind of get you guys to the point and understand the context that everything from 1877 on is happening in. I may have said this in 2010 before to some of you in my earlier class. I really love teaching the first half of the class and the second half of the class. I love both of them. The first part of the class is amazing because I get to cover the American Revolution and the ideas of that time, talk about the founders, and really dig deep into the Constitution. But then it hits this kind of dark part at the end of History 2010, and I kind of leave everyone at a pretty rough time in American history. This is the end of the Civil War, as everyone is, or not everyone, but a lot of people are in bad shape. A lot of the country is destroyed. You see a glimpse of what looks like perhaps equality for black folks on the way, and then you see it very rapidly be taken away. To put it in nerd context, History 2010 is basically like the first half is like Star Wars, right? Where you're like Rebel Alliance versus Empire, and they somehow pull it off. And that's pretty cool. And then the second half of 2010, I would describe as The Empire Strikes Back, where you're like, oh no, this is dark. And at the end of History 2010, we're just kind of left like, oh, where's my hand? That kind of a thing. Can they pull it off? In this class, it's the Return of the Jedi. And if you want to, for you kids out there, it's also episodes 7 through 9, maybe. I don't know. You guys can do that. When I was a kid, there was only 3 of them. So let's get going with the class here into the rise out of this madness and tragedy that is the Civil War. But first, let's get through it. Last class, we talked about the Constitution. Just a reminder for everyone in this class, week 3 in the class meeting, we are going to have a Constitution quiz, Amendments 1 through 15. And the questions are going to be asked from the perspective of the Constitution in 1877 when this class begins. The reason I'm doing that is I want you to understand how the Constitution evolved, understand just how much of what we take for granted now was not there, and to understand why people would want to fight for those and how we ultimately got those rights that many of us, that many of us take for granted, but nevertheless benefit from. So that's that. I want to make sure you guys study it. Check the calendar. I'll be posting the study sessions here today. For next week, there will be several of them. So there we go. Also, the assignment overview and a short study guide is in the assignments folder on D2L. It's been there for a couple of days. Cool? Good deal? All right. Great. Everybody here live, thank you for being here. This is so much better than me just yelling in the room. So, just 1 second here. Let's get strong. All right. Apparently I forgot my water. So, when we last left off, we talked about the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, and what it accomplished. It accomplished a lot, but there were some pretty glaring omissions. Some made deliberately, others that kind of became more obvious over time. And in this context, there are three issues that were not clarified at that convention that became more of an issue as the country evolved. The issue of slavery, as I said, was a compromise. It was kind of understood that if it was brought up, if either side, if the southern states demanded the right to own slaves be enshrined in the Constitution, that the northern states would not agree to it. They might walk out, and the northern states understood that if they tried to get some clarification as to when it might end, or perhaps try to end it altogether, that the southern states would walk out. So they kind of leave it alone. It's not addressed. The southern states feel like that's a victory because they believe that this Constitution protects property and that by all accounts in their world, human beings who are enslaved are their property. So that the federal government can't mess with that. That's what they believe there. Actually, we can't get into this in the class, but even Lincoln, when the Civil War began, when he was elected president, saw no way for him to eliminate slavery short of a constitutional amendment, which would not pass at the time he was inaugurated. It's funny how in 1861, Lincoln was like, I got no clue how we would end slavery, so let's just kind of choke it off so it can't expand. And then 4 years later, boom, there we go. Almost 5 years later, there's that constitutional amendment. Guys, keep believing in yourselves. You never know what might happen. So that's an issue. The second issue is who is a citizen. The Constitution does not resolve that. Who is a citizen of the United States then is a matter of who is a citizen of a state. States have control over that. It's not a federally mandated thing. You become a citizen of the United States by virtue of being a citizen of a state, which means that states can limit your right to vote by not agreeing to let you be a citizen. The Constitution doesn't say that, but it leaves it open. This comes to a head in 1857 with the Dred Scott case. And this brings these first two major issues together. Because in 1857, with no clear statement about this in the Constitution, in 1857, the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Robert Taney, rules that Dred Scott, an enslaved black man, was not free, as the people had been trying to argue. They've been trying to use the court to settle this issue. They got quite the opposite of what they had hoped for. They not only did not get Dred Scott's freedom, the court, in its majority ruling, stated that Dred Scott could not be freed because Dred Scott did not even have standing. He did not have a right to even bring that case because, and this becomes the federal law, because no black person could then or ever could be an American citizen. Thus, from 1857 for the next several years, we have a racial definition of citizenship in the United States. That means that even states that wanted to give citizenship to black Americans could not do so because the Supreme Court had ruled that. What's that?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So, at this time, did they still use the three-fifths compromise?
Yes. Yes, they did. Right? And this is, and well, yeah, and it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's really, having your cake and eating it too, because the southern states were able to even get that more enshrined in the Supreme Court decision. But by this point, the number of enslaved people in the United States is growing quickly because of that plantation life down there. And the international slave trade had been abolished, and it was officially illegal. But there were still bootleggers who were running across and bringing in enslaved people. I mean, they were considered heroes in the Confederacy by illegally keeping open the African slave trade. But what ends up happening there is more a matter of family growth, right? So the population grows. And they get put into the South, into the Deep South. They go through New Orleans. The plantation world is really, I mean, the Deep South is what most of, in the 1840s and 50s is what most of us imagine when we imagine slavery. And that is at the height of its brutality. And what's crazy is Virginia, North Carolina, like Maryland, these places, they can't really grow cotton there. And cotton is what breathes the life into slavery in the 19th century. And those plantations there, I mean, by and large, the founders who thought that slavery was going to go away, they were largely right about tobacco and rice and the things that are grown in Virginia, North Carolina, that region, right? They were by and large correct. Those plantations were not killing it in terms of production. But what they did to make money was they sold the children of enslaved people down to the cotton plantations. So their economy became, not all of the plantations, but a lot of the plantations, the way their economy became propped up was stealing the children of enslaved folks and selling them off to one of the most, what I could say is like probably the greatest hell on earth that has ever been conceived of by the minds of men. And this is why, I mean, you don't even see an abolitionist movement really start to evolve as we conceive of it until the 1830s. But it becomes stronger and stronger, and it's all wrapped up in the expansion of slavery. This becomes the big issue. This is ultimately what leads to the Civil War. I'll just really quickly point this out because I think this is a commonly misunderstood thing. People still want to argue that slavery wasn't the root cause of the Civil War. Well, and one of the things they say about it is they point to Lincoln's first inaugural address, where Lincoln says that he does not intend to interfere with slavery where it then existed. And he does say that. It's one of these things where, we'll talk about this in the next class meeting, if you leave certain silences in places, then you can actually give facts as long as you keep certain information silent. And you can use facts skipping over the silences that don't work for your story. You can use them to make an argument. And people say, see, Lincoln didn't even want to end slavery. He didn't care about slavery. And if Lincoln said he wasn't going to interfere with slavery, then how could the southern states have left because of slavery? Well, the thing that you have to understand about that time and place is that southern plantation owners, that system had to expand to stay alive. It depleted the soil. It was not a technology intensive system. In other words, there weren't new technological innovations increasing increasing productivity of labor in the same way as there were in manufacturing. There were some innovations, but certainly not at that pace. So what you need to, if you're going to keep the cotton plantation world going, you need to keep it moving. You need to open up lands for it. And when Lincoln said, "I do not intend to interfere with slavery where it currently exists," the powerful words there are "where it currently exists," because the entire Republican program that had grown out of the Anti-Nebraska Act, out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the goal was to end slavery not through the federal government. As I said, they didn't think they could do that. Lincoln himself read it was not within his power or the federal government's power at that time. But what they hoped to do was to choke it off, keep it where it was. And the Southern plantation owners knew exactly what that meant, because the fights in the decade and a half leading up to the Civil War had been about where slavery could go and where it couldn't go, and they knew exactly what the Republicans were up to. So that's kind of where we are. Also, just shout out to some documents. If you guys, I don't have time in here to get into the strong case that I can make against the argument that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. But if you would like to find out from someone who might know, I highly suggest you read the secession ordinances issued by the Southern states themselves. I've always thought if I wanted to know why someone did it, if I wanted to know, if I wanted to know why you picked the place that you lived, I could ask you, or I could ask my uncle at Thanksgiving. I suspect that you might have a more accurate answer than someone who is kind of listening through hearsay. The Southern states, several of them, actually issued documents stating the reasons they're leaving, and they're pretty clear that they're leaving to maintain slavery. It takes a lot of gymnastics to get around that. But there's been a whole industry of people writing history and telling history in ways that obscure that. That was a later on thing. Most people at the time knew what they were fighting for, which is the reason that by the last year of the Civil War, between 30 and 50% of the entire Confederate Army just abandons. That's a story we don't hear a lot from the people who are like, my ancestors fought in the Civil War. It's like, did he fight in the Civil War? Because my third great grandfather, George Washington Strong, was conscripted into the North Carolina Army and sent off to fight for the Confederate cause. But he got conscripted in January of 1865, and by April they could not find him because he went back home. And some of you guys are probably like, "Damn, I wish he would have gone off and died so you wouldn't be here, Dr. Sawyer." That's mean, but he wasn't alone when he did that. Is all I'm saying. I've always said that if we want to make a statue to honor the Confederate soldier, we shouldn't forget about the ones that were just like, to hell with this, and went back home. I would like to have a statue of a Confederate soldier being like, "That's it, man, I'm gone." I'll support that one, but not the rest. Anyway, there we go. We can talk more about that, right? And as with everything, if you have some evidence you think that is not, that suggests I'm wrong, show it to me. I'm always, again, either I debate something and it turns out I'm right and I know better, or I debate something, turns out I'm wrong, and I have a chance to get right. Only two things can come of putting your ideas on the table. Both good. All right. The last of these is, who are the people? Right? And this is kind of related to the second one, but it talks a lot in there. The people, right? The people shall elect the House of Representatives. The people, but who are they? Who are they? And this is going to be something that is debated a lot. Well, as it turns out, that Civil War, for as brutal as it is, it actually helped solve these questions. For this reason, some people have referred to it as the Second American Revolution. So this war is awful. It is brutal. It is, I could say it over and over again. I don't know what else to say but that. Go and read some of the accounts of people who fought through it. It's awful. In these years, eventually the Union wins, but the South is leveled. Most of the major cities. But as a result of this, you get these three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And they resolve those questions largely. But as always, a law is only as good as its enforcement. Just to go back, we had the 12th Amendment was the last one we talked about. The way that I forgot to tell in the last lecture the way to remember that one. which is the 12th Amendment changes the electoral college process. Instead of having first and second place in the electoral college determining president and vice president, it now becomes that there's two separate votes, right? So you can have a running mate for the first time in 1804, which allowed Thomas Jefferson to ditch Aaron Burr and find a new vice president, which is pretty useful because about the same time that amendment passed, Aaron Burr shot a guy in Weehawken, New Jersey, and then ran off out west. Met with the British agent. Talked about possibly working with them to take over Louisiana. He's an awful person anyway. So they changed that one. Burr's largely a part of it because of what happened in 1800. Won't get into it. But so the 12th Amendment determines who's number 1 and number 2 in the executive office, right? It changes number 1 and number 2 in the executive office. That's the 12th Amendment. 1, 2, 12. 1, 2, 12. That's the first and second. That's how you can remember that one. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. You can remember that one because bad news for them plantation owners. Number 13 was not lucky for them, but lucky for humanity. That abolishes slavery. That is passed in December of 1865. It took a long time. It's largely a result of the fact that you guys know how this works, right? In the Constitution, a constitutional amendment has to be passed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, then signed by 3/4 of the states. Well, during the Civil War, the southern states leave. They don't show up to Congress anymore, as you might expect. One guy does, Andrew Johnson. God, I wish he wouldn't have, though. But that's another story. But they leave, and so that leaves the radical Republicans who eventually take over. Radical Republicans, they were like, well, people should have rights, and they were like, you are crazy. That leaves the Republicans in charge, so they're able to push more things through. And as a result of the defeat, the first term that gets brought up for the southern states being brought back in is that they ratify the 13th Amendment. And once it's ratified, it kind of goes into place. I would like to just hold on a second. I want to bring this in here. I can't remember, but I need to know the exact one on here. All right, this is funny. It's not funny. It's troubling, but well, you'll see what I'm talking about. All right, so I always got to get this year exactly right because if I just say broadly, I knew it kind of roughly when it was. So the 13th Amendment gets added to the Constitution in December of 1865. But does anyone want to take a swing at what year Mississippi finally ratified the 13th Amendment?
I want to say it was in the 1900s.
Nope. (2013) Mississippi finally filed the paperwork to submit their approval of the 13th Amendment in 2013. So I'm just saying. I mean, it's not like, don't worry. Some people are like, so they still had slavery down there? It's not how it works. Once it's added to the Constitution, it applies to everybody. But they did not submit their paperwork till 2013. You know, in life, if people have a certain impression of you and you want to change it, don't do exactly what they thought you would do. That would be my suggestion for that. Anyway, so there we go. 13th. The 14th Amendment settles some of the other questions. And this one is really, really, really crucial. Sorry, for some reason, my computer decided just to open up a bunch of things that I'm not using. All right. So, sorry about this. Start hearing that fan blowing. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I'm hot. It's like, shut up. All right. I don't say that to it. I say that to you guys. And it hears it. That's the way it works. So the 14th Amendment is crucial because the 14th, after abolishing slavery, you still have the issue on the table that the Supreme Court has ruled that black folks can't be citizens. So enslaved people are free, but what the hell does that mean? What's freedom without opportunity? What's freedom and membership in a country if you do not have the fundamental mark of citizenship, which is the right to vote? That's where the 14th Amendment comes in. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that creates the legal standard that everyone born on American soil is an American citizen. That's where that comes in. Before this, the Constitution had said all kinds of things about what rights people had, but it had never said anything about who was a citizen. For the first time, you have this here in this amendment. It also directly responds to some problems that happened after the Civil War. And I was just, we just recorded an episode of the podcast this week about the 1776 report, which had come out. It was a Trump administration initiative to create a patriotic history. And it was a response to the 1619 project, which was a New York Times project. So we discussed it. And one of, I think, the biggest problems with our understanding of history comes with this period after the Civil War. And I don't think it's all malicious. This is the thing that people don't get, is that when I say that, I've heard, how many of you heard people say, and I mean, I've heard this from many people, heard people say, I don't know, all these black folks are whining. Slavery ended 150 years ago. Why are they still complaining? Have you guys heard that before? I've heard that. Just go on the internet sometime. It's there. It's all over there. Go on Facebook. Go on your stepdad's Facebook. That's what I'm saying. Or your uncle. I don't know. Whichever. You got one in your family. You know what I'm saying? You got one of those. We all do. We all got our mega conservative uncle, and then we all got our mega liberal cousin who comes over to fight at Thanksgiving with your mega conservative uncle, and they don't learn anything from each other. They just yell at each other and make everybody else uncomfortable. Like, we're just trying to watch the Lions lose, like always. Anyway, but you'll see it, man. I've heard that, and this is the only way that you could even make a statement like that. It is so inaccurate. It neglects some of the most powerful themes in American history after the Civil War. The only way would be complete ignorance of those facts. And that's something that we've created with the education a lot of us have gotten. And I don't think it's necessarily a deliberate decision to write that out. I think it allows that ignorance to persist. The problem, and I think why this happens, and the reason that right now in this class, which starts in 1877, we are talking about the 1860s, is because I think that in the way that we've taught U.S. history, when I was younger, it was up to 1865, right? And then after 1865. And now, I'm 42 now, so they were like, well, we should probably, it's a lot of years going on 2020. Maybe we should move it back to 1877. And most universities have done that, and schools have done that now. But what ends up happening is that either 1865 or 1877 become the end and the beginning, and we don't get that through line from the Civil War through the 1870s and 1877. And if we miss that through line, we are left with a fundamentally incomplete understanding of what happens in the country. Because after the Civil War, the people who were plantation owners do not disappear. They don't go, oh, well, I guess we lost. Constitution says slavery's bad now. Sorry, guys. And then go, hey, no, they don't just wake up the morning after Lee surrenders and go, dude, were we treating people different because light reflects off their skin differently? That was crazy. They don't do that. They're angry. They are in a state of defeat. The entire system upon which their power rested was the plantation slave system. And that's gone now. And that's where most, aside from land in the South and the Southern economy, there were two major sources of wealth. It was land and human beings. And when the human beings were gone because of the 13th Amendment, that wiped out a large portion of Southern wealth. But it also made the land less valuable, because the reason the land was valuable was because of the plantation system. A lot of folks went off to fight. And this notion of like white supremacy, and I will say that the United States, we have to call it a white supremacist country in a lot of its history. And that sounds provocative when I say that, because that's a phrase people use around. They're just like, oh, what's that? You don't believe in global warming? You're a white supremacist. I mean that word literally when I say it. A society in which people believed that white people were supreme to other people. By the way, acknowledging this shouldn't be a problem. I don't know why people feel a deep sense that if they admit that about something that happened a long time ago, somehow they're complicit. But this system is still in place. And it's the institutions that are set up afterwards that are going to continue the disparity of opportunity for white folks and black folks. Abby, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Actually, yeah, it was from a while ago. What year was the 14th and 15th Amendment?
So the 14th Amendment was added in 1868, and the 15th will be added in 1870.
In 1870, you said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're fine. I was just curious.
Yeah. So these come in a burst, right? And this is one of the things I pointed out in the first lecture is that we see moments where there are long gaps. Like when the 13th Amendment is added in 1865, it's the first amendment added to the Constitution since 1804. And after 1870, when the 15th Amendment is ratified, it's going to be 1913 when you get the 16th Amendment. And in that same year, you get the 17th. And by 1920, you've got up to 19th, right? So you see moments where people look to the Constitution to rectify injustice, and other times when they don't. So to this point here about the way that white supremacy is reinstitutionalized in the South after the Civil War, it happens in a lot of ways. But one of the first attempts in Southern states is to say, okay, well, you're not enslaved anymore. But first of all, as far as we're concerned, you're not a citizen. Dred Scott's still there. So we're going to pass a different set of laws for black folks than for white folks. It's called black codes. And one of the big things is they say, all right, every black person has to sign a contract saying they will stay and work at a certain place. And they pass vagrancy laws to go on top of that. And what a vagrancy law is, it says if you are found to be a vagrant, i.e. you don't have proof that you work somewhere, you're violating the law. You can be arrested. You can be charged a fine. Well, dude, you were just considered property a couple months ago. You got money to pay a fine? Probably not. So they say, well, if you can't pay the fine, well, somebody else will pay it for you, and in return, you'll have to work for that person for a certain number of years to work off your debt. What's that sound like? It's not slavery in the same way that you own the person, but it damn sure keeps you there by force of the government. That's a big one. They also, informally, old boy networks spring up. And they make deals. They say, look, we need these folks to stay here. Because remember what I told you, the land's valuable because the people were working it. If they leave, you're in trouble. So they work out old boy systems, informal systems, where if you see a black person around your farm that you had never seen before, string them up, make an example out of them. I do the same. Again, the silence. If you guys have ever been to a historic plantation house, you might have heard the story, as I have many times, about, well, there's kind of this uncomfortableness about acknowledging the impact that the enslaved people there on the plantation had. I mean, in other words, they did the work. You go to a plantation house, they all talk about how, hey, so-and-so built this house in this year. Go to a plantation house. You can tell a lot about a person. You ask them, hey, who built this house, right? I do this at the Hermitage sometimes. Who built this house? And there's usually you get two different answers. Some people go, oh, it was built by contractors. A lot of the enslaved people here built this house, and they talk about the difference. They're like, yeah, there was a lot of, the enslaved people here they had multiple skills, like they had to learn all this stuff, and there's this recognition. Other times you get somebody who go, who built this house? They go, why, Andrew Jackson built this house. And I'm like, damn, he must have been strong. He built the whole house? There is a fundamental difference in those two answers, though. But you also get the story about, hey, okay, so there were like enslaved people here. Yeah. But almost every plantation house I've ever been to, guess what they told me? They acknowledged that there were enslaved people there, but they told me that the enslaved people there had it pretty good. You guys ever heard that story before? Anybody ever heard that story? I didn't have it so bad here. Ooh, wow. That's fantastic. See, I thought they were enslaved, but now you're telling me they had it pretty good. So which one is it? Well, here's the thing. They'll say, well, they had it pretty good here. Had it so good that, in fact, after slavery ended, they didn't even leave. And you're like, damn, man, they didn't put an application at the Walmart to try to get a job at the gas station? This must have been a pretty nice place to work. Except for they leave out some pretty crucial facts about black codes, about those old boy networks, about the fact that they were still surrounded by a group of people that loathed them and look down on them? Again, the silence. It is true that enslaved black people stayed to work on their plantations, but what was out there for them? A lot of fear, a lot of violence. Was not so much the pull of the plantation as it was the fear of what awaited them if they left. So you have that. And these black codes are a problem. So Congress responds again. And at this point, Andrew Johnson has become the president. Some people say that Andrew Johnson is the worst thing that Abraham Lincoln ever did to America. I think I agree with him. Andrew Johnson was drunk on the day he was inaugurated as vice president. He spoke too long. He yelled at people, called them the wrong names. And then when Hannibal Hamlin, the former vice president, pulled on his coattails and told him to wrap it up, Andrew Johnson leaned over, looked at the crowd, said, "I kissed this book in the face of my country, the United States," and then leaned over and kissed the Bible drunkenly. That was it. To which Lincoln said, "Do not let him speak anymore outside. Do not let him speak." Frederick Douglass likewise noted that Johnson was pretty drunk when they met. Johnson was a white supremacist. He had been added to the ticket for Lincoln for his second run. And when he comes in, he gives a pretty lenient view to these Southerners. He is one of them. He's from Tennessee. He's from North Carolina, but he came here to Tennessee. And he hated plantation owners, but he didn't hate slavery. He didn't hate white supremacy. He believed firmly in that. He just didn't like plantation owners because he grew up poor and they were not nice to him. He got a chip on his shoulder. He kind of gives the southern states a pretty easy deal. And then Congress comes back in session and goes, "You did what?" Because Congress comes back in session in December of 1865. They had been gone since the spring. They come back in session, and guess who's there waiting to meet them? Delegates from the southern states showing back up to Congress in 1865 like nothing happened, just like that uncle does who started a fight last time, ruined Thanksgiving, shows back up and likes to pretend like nothing happened. We still cool, right? And the southern states sent a clear message they weren't sorry. In fact, Georgia sent as a senator from Georgia in December of 1865 a guy named Alexander Stephens. You might know him also as the former vice president of the Confederacy. 4 months ago, second in command in the Confederacy. Now he's back being like, "Hey, let's talk about this." Congress goes, "Nope." They refuse to seat him, and Congress takes over. And they begin addressing these issues. They pass a Civil Rights Act, which enshrines a lot of rights, but they realize that it could be deemed unconstitutional, so that's why they push for the 14th Amendment. It ensures citizenship, but it also guarantees equal protection under law. This is another fundamental thing. When you say this, it means that it's now illegal to pass laws for white folks and one set of laws for black folks. So it's a direct attempt to fight this system in the South that's trying to emerge. And for a while in the South, because of the efforts of the federal government, because of these new rights, black folks are able to participate in Southern governments. They vote. And this is powerful. I told you, Mississippi, more than half that population is black. South Carolina, more than half that population is black. And now they can vote. And they do. State of Mississippi sends a black senator to the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels. In the 1860s and 1870s, 1880s, there are numerous black congressmen, 2 black senators, over a dozen black members of the House of Representatives sent from southern states. They're participating. Did you guys know this? Did you guys know there were black members of Congress in the 19th century? A lot of people don't. A lot of people are surprised by that. I get it. I remember finding out and being surprised too. And then I realized that what was surprising shouldn't have been that they were black members of Congress, because you got millions of black folks in the South. Statistically, that should have happened. The surprising fact is that for decades after that, there are no black members of Congress. That's the story. But in the 1860s, 1870s, Congress fights this, and that's the 14th Amendment. It overturns Dred Scott. But they don't give up, which is why you got to have a 15th Amendment. It's like, well, we thought we clarified that you could not passed a set of laws. You could not deny a person the right to vote, right? In fact, it says if you deny people the right to vote, you'll lose proportional representation in Congress. It's got teeth to it if it's enforced. But there's other ways to get around it. So southern states start saying, look, this isn't about whether or not you're black or white. Okay? This is for everybody. But if you ever were, or anybody in your family ever was a slave, then you can't vote. Cool? White people too. It's not just about black folks. And so Congress goes, okay, 15th Amendment. You cannot deny someone the right to vote on the basis of their previous condition of servitude. That should tell you something. In this period in between, Andrew Johnson tries to prop up this white supremacist system. There's a moment after the Civil War, and Lincoln being assassinated is a tragedy. Just at the end of the Civil War, Congress had established what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. It was established to help previously enslaved black folks, who were called freedmen, adjust, find land. If you have some type of aversion to the federal government helping people find land, I would like to refer you to the Louisiana Purchase, to the Mexican-American War, to the Oregon Treaty, this is kind of what it does, right? I love these people who are like, the government didn't used to get involved in people's lives. And I'm like, well, except for when it sent the U.S. Army to clear the land of the people who lived there to hand it out to American citizens, which I would consider pretty firm intervention in people's lives. Andrew Johnson is a thorn in the side of Congress. Just before Lincoln is assassinated, the Freedmen's Bureau was given hundreds of thousands of acres of land that had been seized by Confederates. Seized from the Confederates. Grant had gone around this area of the world when he was here on the Western, Ulysses S. Grant. And one of the things he did was whenever he cleared land and took it, Grant was pretty amazing in what he wanted to do, try to help black folks. He would essentially disprove the white folks who had said these black folks couldn't do anything if it weren't for us telling them what to do. Because Grant would go in and clear out of the plantation. The owners would run, leave the land behind. Grant would go in there and use his authority as a U.S. general, backed up by the Emancipation Proclamation later on. He would go in there and be like, hey, we're seizing all of this property here on this plantation. Hey, you guys run it. And I'll be damned if the black folks didn't know how to run the whole thing because they've been doing it the whole time. Grant would put black folks in charge of military outfits to prove that they were worthy to fight. And this Freedmen's Bureau now, this seized land, is supposed to be handed out to emancipated black folks. And it's primed to do that. But when Johnson comes into power, he uses his executive authority to take the land that was allocated for the freedmen, give that land back to the Confederate who had owned it. You guys know that story about 40 acres and a mule? You guys ever heard that? 40 acres and a mule. The black folks were all going to get, these enslaved folks, previously enslaved folks, were now going to get 40 acres and a mule to help them adjust. It's an old saying. Well, that was actually something that might have happened and was already beginning to happen before Andrew Johnson single-handedly canceled that and gave it back to the Confederates. That changes the lives of a lot of people. (1870). Ulysses S. Grant is president by this point. He's dedicated to progress for black folks. It's got a corrupt administration, that's for sure. Grant was a sucker. Grant was one of the greatest military minds that ever lived. But boy, if you tried to sell him some oceanfront land in Oklahoma, he'd buy it from you. He's just too gullible. Got conned out of his entire life savings. Actually, kind of good for us. He got conned out of everything. So at the end of his life, he was desperate for money, and he needed to make some. So he finally agreed for a publisher to write his memoirs. But Grant wasn't going to really sit down and write them. So he told the memoirs. Basically, he had a ghostwriter, and so he told his story to a young writer who then actually wrote the memoir for him. At the time, nobody knew of this guy, a guy named Samuel Clemens. But it turns out that guy was Mark Twain later on. And so actually one of Mark Twain's first jobs was ghostwriting Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. Pretty lucky, huh? we know a lot about him. But by 1870, it's 15th Amendment. The enthusiasm for ensuring progress for black folks in the South at the federal level has begun to wane. Southern congressmen have returned. In the South, you have this devastation. We talked already about the Freedmen's Bureau, its hopes, and then it's being dismantled. This is the thing about the executive. Congress establishes a Freedmen's Bureau. The executive is supposed to enforce that and make that happen. Remember, the executive branch, in theory, executes the laws, by and large, that Congress passes. That's why it's called the executive branch. So Andrew Johnson just says no. So, with very limited influence, the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866 records as in Memphis, the white citizens of the city turn on the black folks and massacre about 150 of them. Take everything they've got. Goes on for 3 days until finally federal troops are there to put it down. You guys may have heard that story about how the North occupied the South after the Civil War. You should go look into what those troops did. Did things like end riots, make sure that more didn't break out. If you guys don't know about the Memphis Massacre, you guys should look into it, 1866. Many of these folks who were killed and robbed were just returning home from service in the U.S. Army. They had gotten a payout to start their lives. Taken from them. Gradually, these states are readmitted to the Union. By 1870, they've all returned. Georgia's the last one. And in all of this, you've got tons of problems. It ain't just black folks who got problems in the South. This economy is devastated. You got to remember that a large portion of the Confederate Army was made up of people that did not choose to be there. They were conscripted. They were drafted. Same with the Union Army. Families lose children. A large portion of young men in the South come back wounded, disabled. There's no pension for the Confederate Army. It is a region that has been destroyed. Souls broken. The sense that you've been forced to go off and fight for something. And you lost. How do you solve that? One of the things that ends up happening is that in order to solve the problem of the South, where the plantation owners don't have cash to pay anybody wages, they use that contract system at first, right? They use these laws. But one of the things they eventually come to is a system called sharecropping, by which large plantations are broken up into smaller plots. A lot of previously enslaved and even some poor white families turn to this system, and the system, in a lot of places, is stacked against them. So you want to get started? Okay, cool. Here's your land. You're going to give me a share of it at the end of the year. But you're going to need seeds, right? You're going to need a horse? Going to need a plow? Well, I can front them to you. But you're going to have to pay me back at interest. That'll keep you stuck to the land. That's going to persist well into the 20th century, by the way. I still have students who have told me that their grandparents were sharecroppers. It's not a system that's going to lead to prosperity and opportunity. But eventually what happens after 1870 is that, as I said, a lot of Americans begin to believe, even in the North, that they've done their job, that they've passed these amendments, that they've ensured the institutional structure, and their dedication to preserving the rights in the South is kind of causing some problems with getting along and reuniting the country. And so they begin to turn a blind eye to the South. And this is when you see the return of the Confederate class, no longer slave owners, but nevertheless deeply, deeply committed to white supremacist ideology, explicitly coming back to power. Things like the KKK scare these folks away from using their rights. Grant was able to actually pass the KKK Act, which helped bring that first KKK down, but other organizations use the same structure. They figure out other ways to disenfranchise people. Right? Now, remember, the 14th Amendment says you can't deny it on, everyone has equal protection, everyone's a citizen. Then they have to go, oh, well, okay, all right, well, you can't say, the previously enslaved person, you can't do that thing. It's be like, well, it's for everybody. But that's not like, well, that capped it. That doesn't cap the ways that you can deny a person the right to vote. There's another way, and this is the big one. What you can do in your state is you can pass a law that says that anyone convicted of a felony does not have the right to vote. And then you can target black citizens, convict them of felonies, deny them their rights on trial in many cases, and just strip them of their right to vote. The system of felon disfranchisement in this country, that's where it's from. There's a great book by Pippa Holloway, who was previously a professor at MTSU, has moved to University of Richmond. She's amazing. She wrote a book called Living in Infamy. And in that book, she walks you through. And they're not hiding it. This isn't something, sometimes people are like, oh, come on. No, go look at the documents from the debates in like Florida. In states where they pass it, they're not worried. By the time they start passing these things, it's all the same old boys back in power that have been in power before. They say straight up, we can target black folks, make certain crimes felonies. And by doing so, we can take away their right to vote, take away their power, keep them from sending those black folks to Congress anymore. It's right in front of you. Abby, yeah.
I think I'm just like a little confused. So the 15th Amendment, was this before or was this like a reaction to like literacy tests and stuff to like prevent African Americans from voting? Was that like before and then they started doing literacy exams and stuff like that, or was this after?
No, that's a good question. No. So felon disfranchisement, as I just said, is one way that you can keep black folks from voting. Another one, as you just said, is literacy tests. And we'll get into these. Literacy tests, poll taxes, which actually keep all poor folks away from the, white folks and black folks, but they keep black folks away, so that's fine. You got to break some eggs if you want some omelets as far as some of these people in power are concerned. But poll tests, yeah. You make people show that they can read and write, but you don't give them to everybody. No one there to see it, right? Give a different test to black folks than you give to white folks. Later on, once Plessy versus Ferguson is in place, which establishes separate but equal in the 1890s, which pulls the teeth out of this 14th Amendment. Another way you can do it is by having segregated lines for your voters. White folks in one line and black folks in another line. And then you can have inspectors show up to make sure that nobody's voting that's not supposed to, and you put them in line with the black folks, and you really, really, really spend a lot of time checking all of their information to make sure they're not cheating to vote. And, oh, damn, it's 7 p.m., the polls closed, sorry, and there's a whole line of black folks standing outside that didn't get to vote.
So the 15th Amendment happened, and then
1870, yeah. Right. So you see it already. The 15th Amendment is a response to the first attempt. So some of these first attempts to keep black folks from voting and exercising their power, right? And Congress goes, no. And Grant has to fight to get that through. Even though the president plays no role in the amendment process, he goes around and speaks and really advocates for that. But then when the next stuff happens, Congress is done doing these things. They happen. They're going to happen until the 1960s on the books. Yeah, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the big one.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So now imagine you were an entire group of people who for the first 100 years of your existence in the United States were treated as property. And you get your freedom, and you're immediately thrown into a series of ever-changing institutions targeted at you to keep you from being able to vote, to keep you from being able to move. Isn't one of the, we talk about this, right? Free labor, the market system. What makes us prosperous is our ability to move places. That's a fundamental part of it. But if you use violence to keep people in place on plantations, they can't go somewhere else. They're not in a market for wages. They're paid what you damn well pay them. So this really, you see this begin already by the end of the 1860s. But a lot of people say 1870s might really mark the end with the passage of the 15th Amendment, the sense we've done enough from Congress. The Democrats come back to power. The Southern Democrats have been the largest portion. Republicans always knew this, that the Western states have Democrats. And it's a long history of the West and the South being in kind of an interesting coalition where they're very different, but they join parties together. Once the Southern Democrats came back in, the Southern states come back in, they're going to merge with the Western Democrats. And there's some in the Midwest and the North, but they're going to merge together. But because the Southern Democrats are going to be the largest portion of that party, they're going to control the agenda, and they do. And they immediately begin fighting against the laws and Congress's enforcement of the laws in the South. And you start seeing that whereas earlier on there were responses from the federal government to massacres, even if slow, even if imperfect, stop happening. And one of the key ones occurs in 1873. It's called the Colfax Massacre. And this massacre, 150 black folks are surrounded and shot down in cold blood. Colfax, Louisiana. They're Republicans, and the black folks have voting power there. And one of the things you can do is eliminate a lot of their leaders, eliminate a lot of them, and send a message. And them doing that, and there being no response from the federal government, was a nod. And it's this point that the white supremacists who had run the country, or the South, the Southern states by and large, from before the Civil War, really understand that they've got the power to take things back. They start writing histories too. Southerners start writing histories, retelling the story of the Civil War as if it weren't about slavery. They tell stories about how when the black folks had power in the South, they had ruined everything. They were irresponsible. They weren't smart enough to handle that responsibility. They were corrupt. And they start telling the story of what happens in the 1870s, and they call it redemption, the Southern redemption. They're the redeemers, return control to the people who are really supposed to have the power. That's the story they tell. That's where your story about the Civil War not being about slavery comes from. Now, I'll point this out here. I want to provide a little evidence here for my statement, especially because I understand that the phrase white supremacy, as I said, has become like a trigger word. It's become like an insult, right? But it means something, and I mean it in its truest sense. That Colfax massacre where 150 black folks were shot dead, here in that town of Colfax, Louisiana, there are two markers that tell that story. Remember, markers are the way that we say what's important, right? We decide the silent, what we say and what we don't say. And here you go. On the left is one that was put up in 1973, but the one on the left was put up in 1921. Okay? Here is the wording. Erected to the memory of the heroes, Stephen Decatur Parrish, James Westernot, Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax riot, that's a word, who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy. Because what I didn't tell you was that in that riot, 3 white folks died. 150 black folks died. 3 white folks died. The people of that town decided to put up a marker to tell that story. And they honored the 3 white folks who died. And what were they defending? White supremacy.
And they called them heroes, too.
Mm-hmm. They call them heroes. Again, that phrase white supremacy, I use it because they used it. And it wasn't an insult to them. So that's the one in 1921. Then on the right here, 1950. On this side occurred the Colfax riot. Again, the word riot, that's interesting. These words we choose to describe things do have real power. On this side occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13th, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. The carpetbaggers, you guys heard that story if you're in the South. These northern Yankees who came down here and tried to upend our power, put these irresponsible black folks in power who couldn't manage it. Just go read some of the speeches from the floor of the Congress by the black members of the House and the black members of the Senate. Pretty amazing words. They're intelligent. He came out of a system that had treated them as human cattle. In a short time, black folks became very active citizens. And for a moment, they saw a spark. They saw hope. I've heard some people say that the hardest times for people, it's not just when things are bad, but it's when things are bad and you get a little hope and it's ripped away from you. Millions of people experience that. On top of everything else. At this point, I'll tell you something. It's amazing to me the way that we have a real hard time processing this legacy, right? I mean, think about what I've just told you so far. Think about how much has to be left out for that statement. Well, slavery ended in 1865. Why are people still complaining? Think about how much you have to leave out of that story to say that. It's a lot. But if you look at, even today, look at the statistics. Black poverty rate in the United States is more than double the white poverty rate. As far as I can tell, there are two possible reasons for that. One is that black folks aren't as good as white folks. That's fucking stupid. The other one is that something happened. And it did. And it happened over and over and over again. The thing is, we didn't do that. We were alive. I was born in 1978. Acknowledging that doesn't mean anything about me as a white person. I don't understand why people do feel that way. The question you have to ask yourself now is whether or not you want to continue to ignore the problems or whether or not you want to look at history and learn, start talking about them. Whatever conclusions we reach can be different. That is okay. But when they are based on a deliberate ignorance of the facts, we will not solve the problems. It's the first step towards solving a problem. Admitting you have a problem. This all comes to a head in 1877. That's the reason this year marks the beginning of this class and the end of the last, and the Compromise of 1877. There's a disputed election. It's the first time it looks like a Democrat is going to win the White House since old James Buchanan won back in 1856. But Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, runs against him, and in the end, there's a dispute over the election results. This is the point where I can be like, all right, finally Florida wasn't the problem in this last election. Thank God. Finally Florida. Because every other time it's freaking Florida. All right. And in this election, it was Florida. All right. In 2000, it was Florida. I guess Florida gets a little bit of a pass this time. But one of the states disputed was Florida. In the end, Rutherford B. Hayes, he went to bed the night of the election thinking he had lost. He went to go give his concession speech and got a telegraph. Do not do that. We've got some new information. They sent it to a committee. The committee decides that Hayes won, and the Southern Democrats say, we're not going to sit back and take this. We will filibuster. We'll cause problems. So you need to sit down and talk. We might accept that presidency, but there's some terms we want. And they reach a compromise. Southerners agreed to recognize the legitimacy of Rutherford B. Hayes as president. But in return, they have a list of demands. The two most significant for the purposes of what moves forward are, number one, they want all of the federal troops that are sent there to uphold civil rights for black folks, they want those offices closed and they want those folks gone. Again, no witness, no crime. This allows southern states to get back to doing what they want to do, without having to worry about the complications of there being offices where black folks could report what's happening. Remember, the 14th Amendment says if you deny people the rights, you could lose representation in Congress. But now, there's no one to see that. The second thing it does, southern states say, look, this federal money that you guys have been sending down here to build railroads and develop infrastructure and all of that, is particularly to help the black folks in the South, these programs. Now look, we'd like for you to still send us the money, but instead of giving it directly to like offices down here that give it to them, or like federal offices or federal institute, give it to the states. And if you can just give it to us, then we'll make sure that it goes where you guys want it to go. That's going to allow the southern states to continue to receive federal funding while making sure that that funding does not go to black citizens. That is going to continue all this for decades. So in 1877, this compromise, you see the formal end in most people's minds of any dedication of the federal government to civil rights in the South. And you also see that replacing that focus has become the West. The lands that had been annexed by the United States formally but had not been settled. This new frontier. And the thing that's going to help bring the North and the South back together, one of them, but one of the most powerful, is going to be unifying in one army to fight the Indians in the West. That's where we'll pick up in the next lecture. Thank you guys for being here. Have a great day. I will say this about Star Wars, though. It's funny how generations are different. Like, when I was a kid, my son's 6. Saw him, he's 6. When I was a kid, we mostly just ran in the woods and pretended to kill each other. That's basically what we did. It was a real weird thing growing up in the country where I was from, because I was told you don't mess around with guns. You don't even pretend like a stick is a gun. You don't point your finger at somebody. There's a real deep respect for it. But boy, as soon as they were gone, we were shooting people with our hands, with sticks, with anything we could find. There'd always be that kid whose parents would be like, here, these guns don't work, I don't think. And they'd just be running around with them. But my son lives in a different world. And I watched Empire Strikes Back with him. And whenever Darth Vader revealed that he was Luke's father, Solomon kind of stared at the screen. And I said, Solomon, did you hear that? Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's daddy. And Solomon goes, why did his daddy cut off his hand? That was a different interpretation. He was shocked. He was like, why is his daddy being mean to him? And that's when I realized I don't think I've ever seen my son pretend to kill any of his friends. And, things change. It's fine.